Hello and welcome back to the Powered by Football podcast, your favourite Power Chair football podcast hosted by Jackson Taylor. We've got some very fun stuff on for you today. We have got Hills United versus Football St George in both the Championship and the Premiership. We've got a catch-up game between Sydney FC and Football St George in the Championship. And we've also got Sydney FC versus the Newcastle Jets in both the Championship and the Premiership. We've also got a podcast first for the Powered by Football podcast, your favourite Power Chair football podcast, hosted by Jackson Taylor, with an interview with Michael Suffield, our first referee interview to ever be on this podcast. So, without further ado, let's get into it. In the opening match between Hills United and Football St George in the Championship, there's some strong Hills pressure which forced a corner in the opening minutes, but it wasn't able to be converted. Football St George began to ease into the game afterwards, but they weren't able to convert their own chances. Lachie Ninham tried to dribble around the St George defence, trying to score a similar goal to the one he did against the Western Sydney Wanderers last week, but he wasn't successful. There was continued pressure from the Hills, but it was unable to be converted, and at half-time, it was 0-0 between Hills United and Football St George. A penalty was given not long after the break, which saw Lachie Ninham send Hills United 1-0 up. Football St George had a counter not long after, but they just weren't able to convert. And just before the end of the game, there was a high sideline for Football St George, which saw Finn O'Donovan set the ball up well for Ruben McLean to equalise. And that was the full-time score, 1-1 between Football St George and Hills United. Over to the Premiership equivalent of that game, and there was strong passing from Football St George at the start of the match, but it couldn't be converted. Similarly, they had a corner which they weren't able to get in the goal, so the score stayed at 0-0. A rare chance for Hills minutes later was unable to be converted. There was an interception for St George, which saw their attack string some really nice passes together, with Abdullah Karim setting Chris Turnbull up well to send St George 1-0 up. There was some strong dribbling from Hills, which saw them try and weave around the St George defence, but they weren't able to do this, and the halftime score was 1-0 to Football St George. A Hills counter goes out for a goal kick after a long-range shot from a seam Soddy is missed. And then not long after that, Football St George engulfed the Hills, spreading their defence apart, with Abdullah Karim setting up Jordan Crane to double Football St George's lead. Strong Hills pressure sees the seam Soddy win a corner, but they weren't able to convert that. So not long after this, a strong hit from Matt Mallows forced an own goal. It was a very tight angle, and Matt, somehow forced the defence to put it in their own goal. So they halved their deficit there to 2-1. Minutes later, a strong passing piece from Football St George sees Jordan Crane set Abdullah Karim up well, sending Football St George 3-1 up. And towards the end of the game, a seeming cross from Abdullah Karim somehow sneaks in, sending Football St George 4-1 up. There's a high free kick right before the end of the match, but Hills weren't able to make any contact to it, therefore not going to be able to get the goal, and the full-time whistle blew, declaring the result to be 4-1 to Football St George. So in the catch-up game played in the middle of the day between Sydney FC and Football St George, there was a set piece for Sydney FC which saw Riley Brown pounce on and score, sweeping between the defence of Football St George. There was lots of pressure from Sydney FC throughout the rest of the first half, but Mitch Albert was doing really well defensively for St George to keep Sydney at bay, and the halftime score was 1-0 to the Sky Blues. St George applied a lot more pressure at the start of the second half, but they weren't able to convert any of it. And there was a free kick in the second half, which, at a tight angle from a 2-on-1, I do believe, saw Harry Simmons set the ball up well for Riley Brown to strike right down the middle of the defence with the two defenders on either post, neither of them able to get there, sending Sydney FC 2-0 up, doubling their advantage. And after that, no more action was had, and the full-time whistle declared Sydney defeating St George 2-0. In the Newcastle Jets versus Sydney FC Championship match, and Cody Town pounced on a Newcastle goal kick early on to send Sydney 1-0 up. George Tiong jumped on a parried save from the Newcastle defence minutes later to double the Sky Blues lead. There was an on-the-line save for the Newcastle defence not long after to keep the score at 2-0. Did some really, really good work there from that whole Newcastle defence. George Tiong assisted Riley Brown from a set piece just outside the box to make the score 3-0, and that is what the score would stay at half time. Consistent Sydney pressure at the start of the second half, but they weren't able to convert until George Tiong split the defence apart about 25 minutes into the game, with Riley Brown guiding it over the line to make the result 4-0. A high sideline for Newcastle spurred a counter, but Newcastle held on strong. There's some strong Sydney pressure not long after, which saw the entire attack linking up really, really well, with George Tiong setting up Cody Town to make it 5 for Sydney. A set piece a minute or so later is just too fast for George Tiong to get to, and he goes out for a goal kick. Sydney suffocated said goal kick, which allowed George Tiong to set up Cody Town for his hat-trick, and Sydney's 6th, with George getting his 4th assist of the game. Some absolutely incredible statistics for these boys. And a goal kick minutes later for Newcastle sees Tarek Brown in an incredibly advanced position set Cody Town up well for his 4th and Sydney's 7th. And that is the full-time score. 7-0 to Sydney FC over the Newcastle Jets. And in the final game of the day, the Newcastle Jets versus Sydney FC in the Premiership. Sydney soaked a lot of Newcastle pressure at the start of the match with some really, really strong saves. Sydney got some half chances halfway through the first half, but nothing that they were able to convert. It was a high sideline for the Jets, saved on the line by Josh Ryan. He did really, really well to turn that one out for a corner. And then a few minutes later, there was another high sideline for Newcastle, which sees Chris Hastert set Dimitri Leolio-Davis up well, slicing home a go-ahead goal just before halftime. Right before halftime, there's a shot from Chris Hastert, which meets the post quite well, but it took a lot of the sting out of it and gave enough time for it to be cleared off the line, keeping the score at 1-0 at halftime. Some strong passes from Sydney puts Newcastle against the ropes at the start of the second half, but the ball goes round the wrong side of the post and out for a goal kick. Newcastle continued to pry throughout the rest of the game, prying this Sydney defence, but there were some really, really strong defensive displays throughout this Sydney FC side. And the full-time whistle blew, the score being 1-0 to the Newcastle Jets. As mentioned previously, I interviewed Michael Suffield to discuss some changes which were happening within the referees of this competition. So here's that clip.
Hey Jackson, my name is Michael Suffield. I am 34 years old. I'm the Vice President of New South Wales PFA and help out with refereeing in our Saturday competition.
Nice. So that last sort of thing is what I wanted to talk to you about today. There's some fancy stuff I noticed with the refereeing this weekend. So I first thing that I noticed was that you got this new fancy earpiece going on between yourself on the sideline and the referees on court. Is this something that was mandated from like above, APFA, FIPFA, whatever, or is this something that you guys are trying to do locally?
Yeah, look, it's definitely not mandated, but it's better practice for referees to have communication devices between them. So we were lucky enough to get a grant at the association. We've used that to provide our referees with communications kits. So it means that the centre referee and our 2 assistant referees on the sidelines and a 4th official, when we have them, can all talk to each other throughout the match and not have to kind of gather in the middle to have a discussion or yell across the court. We can all just stay in touch throughout the game.
Yeah, nice. And did you notice much improvement over the weekend through this?
Look, first weekend using it, so always a bit of trial and error and see how we go. But it certainly makes life easier and enables us to talk about different things. And probably the best thing that we noticed straight away was the central referee doesn't have to focus on every single thing going on. They can just listen to their linesman and ask the linesman, hey, like, can you keep an eye on, 3 in the box and just talk to me if you see one? Or if there's something that happens behind me, can you just tell me what's happened? So it definitely makes everything a lot more efficient for the centre referee and just keeps the game flowing a little bit better.
Yeah, nice. So I was obviously watching you, like as I was watching all the games from the side, taking notes and such, and I was watching you talking from the side, are you just sort of commenting on calls, or are you analysing things more intensely and more deeply?
Certainly internally, I will analyze things very deeply, both from watching the game play out, and I've coached for a long time and enjoy thinking about the tactics of the game. But with the referees, it's just about helping our referees get better. So we've obviously had to work hard to find new referees, and now we're in the process of training them. And one of the benefits of these communications is we can have somebody with a bit more experience on the sideline just talking to the center ref and reminding them of different things. So there are a few times throughout the match where I would just let the center ref know to keep an eye on certain things, or if there was a little bit of confusion, remind them of where the ball gets placed or what players should be where. So look, the important thing is to not over communicate. You do need to let the referee think and control the game themselves. But
Yeah.
it is nice to just have that somebody in your ear reminding you of little things as you go.
Yeah, yeah, I think it is really exciting to see the growth of it. Even you guys are looking more professional, having the fancy ref shirts now, which is a good, sign of just the officialness of the officials, really. So, yeah, it's exciting.
Yeah, and we've been very lucky to get some sponsorship on board for the referees as well. So a group called Northwest Funds have
Mm,
sponsored our referees, and you'll see their name on the back of our shirts if your
yes.
fans go and watch our matches on the live stream on YouTube. And no, it's really exciting to keep progressing the game here in Sydney.
Yeah, yeah, it's really really cool. And the last big question I got for you, Michael, is do you find that when you're talking with the refs from the side versus when you're refereeing a match itself in the center of the court, whatever, do you just see the game differently? Do you read it differently at all? Would you say?
Oh, 100%. I mean, even when you're a center referee, just trying to make sure you're not getting in the way of players or
Yeah.
potentially putting yourself in a dangerous spot
Mm,
can take up a lot of your mental capacity. So to sit on the sideline, you always tend to see a little bit more, I think. However, when you're further away, it also makes it harder to judge a lot of elements of the game. And in our sport, where there are so many things dictated by distance, such as
mm.
the 2-on-1 rule or the 5 meters away from kicks, it's a lot easier to be right next to the players and on the court. But, I'm not that one is better or worse than the other, but, I think these communications and having somebody on the sidelines is extremely helpful for the sport.
Yeah, yeah, I think it's really exciting, to see the sport being taken more seriously, and I think, it's all upwards from here.
100%.
Awesome. Well, before we wrap up, is there anything else you want to add?
No, not too much, Jack. Loving the podcast, loving what you're doing, and
Thank
thanks for
you.
continuing to report on our great sport.
Thank you very much, Michael. Moving over to the championship table and statistics, and the table first. Sydney FC lead the table. They have 7 wins and 1 loss with 21 points. Hills United sits second. They have 5 wins, 2 draws, and 1 loss. They have 17 points. The Western Sydney Wanderers sit third. They have 3 wins, 2 draws, and 3 losses. They have 11 points. Football St George sit fourth. They have 2 wins, 2 draws, and 4 losses. They have 8 points. And the Newcastle Jets sit fifth with 8 losses and 0 points. Over to the statistics now. The goal scorers is led by who else? Riley Brown of Sydney FC. He has 16. Lockie Ninham of Hills United sits second. He has 9. And third place is taken up by George Tiong of Sydney FC. Speaking of George Tiong, he leads the assist chart with 9 for Sydney FC. Second place is taken up by Finn O'Donovan of Football St George. He has 6. And a two-way tie for third between Sydney FC's Riley Brown and Hills United's Lockie Ninham. They both have 3. Over to the clean sheets. Cody Town of Sydney FC leads that. He has 6. A four-way tie for second between Football St George's Ollie McPhail, Hills United's Lockie Ninham and Bailey Pete, and the Western Sydney Wanderers' Jackson Taylor. They all have 2. And a two-way tie for third between the Western Sydney Wanderers' Jay Meta and Sydney FC's Harry Simmons, both on 1. Moving over to the Premiership table and statistics, and the table first. The Newcastle Jets lead that. They have 6 wins, 1 draw, and 1 loss. They have 19 points. Football St George sits second. They have 4 wins, 3 draws and 1 loss. They have 15 points. Sydney FC sit third. They have 4 wins, 1 draw and 3 losses. They have 13 points. The Western Sydney Wanderers sit fourth. They have 1 win, 2 draws and 5 losses. They have 5 points. And Hills United sit last with 1 win, 1 draw and 6 losses on 4 points. Over to the statistics now. And Abdullah Karim of Football St George leads the goal scorers chart. He has 10. Daniel O'Brien of Sydney FC, who's away right now on recovery from a surgery, sits in second. He has 8. And third place is taken up by Chris Hastis of the Newcastle Jets with 7. Over to the assist chart now, and that is also led by Abdullah Karim of Football St George, who has 6. Sydney FC's Fletcher Ball and the Newcastle Jets' Ryan Seck both have 5 in second. And Dimitri Leolio Davis of the Newcastle Jets sits in third with 4. Over to the clean sheets, and that is led by Ryan Seck of the Newcastle Jets with 6. And a 2-way tie for second between Josh Ryan and Harry Simmons of Sydney FC, both on 1. So that brings us to the end of the episode today. Thank you all so much for listening. Now we have got the Power Round coming up next week. So there are 3 championship and 3 premiership games on this Saturday and 3 championship and 3 premiership games on this Sunday. I will do my very best to get the episode out by Tuesday, but if the episode does happen to be a bit later, I do apologize. I will do my very best to get it out. And yeah, without further ado, let's get into the end card. You can get involved in power chair football here in New South Wales as an athlete, coach, referee or volunteer by visiting the New South Wales Power Chair Football Association website, linked in the show notes. Our season takes place in Glenwood at the Valentine Sports Park from the 15th of February 2025 to the 12th of July 2025 every Saturday. Contact info@nswpfa.org.au for more information. Just a quick note that the views of this podcast are mine and mine alone. The opinions and thoughts expressed do not necessarily reflect those of the NSWPFA. If you want to get in touch with the podcast, you can follow us at Powered by Football Pod on Instagram, join our Facebook group, Powered by Football Podcast, or follow our Twitter account, Powered by Pod. Thanks for listening.